Obviously, humility is something that you hold very dear. It just points to how humility, or this sort of attachment to humility, can get in the way.
There's a real romance, there's a real comfort. Actually, there feels like a real purity in the idea of being able to do it without anyone knowing. People feel like it's almost inappropriate to talk about the good they do. Like it's sort of proof that you didn't do it for the right reasons, you did it for the praise and so on.
You are the only person that I know of in all of those years who made that decision in a way for me because of what they learned about the impacts. Oh, I wish I could clone you.
The truth is, you can't do these things. You can't even give time to someone in a moment all the way through to designating your whole career to service without in some way feeling something very profound. You know, you don't need to be a saint these days to create change.
I'm Zoe Weil, and this is Solutionary Voices, where we bring together guests on the forefront of building a more humane, just, and healthy world for all people, animals, and the ecosystems that sustain life. Today, I'm speaking with Tom Cledwin, the co-founder of Drop Dead Generous, an experiment in sparking creative generosity through giving away $500,000, $500 at a time, to people who want to do something kind and then share the story that unfolds. Tom is also the co-creator of the new podcast, Move Over Mother Teresa. If you look for Tom's bio online, you'll discover very little other than that the title that he's given himself is Chief Emailer, which I personally find both hilarious and ironic because Tom can be, in his own words, rubbish at email. I'll let our conversation reveal the true biography of this remarkable man who I am blessed to have as a beloved friend. Tom, welcome.
Hey Zoe, it's so true. I'm a terrible emailer, and yet I'm chief emailer. Oh no.
It's kind of a crazy title. I think you might want to rethink that.
I think I should change that.
So always the first question on the show is, what problem are you working to solve?
We're looking at trying to solve the problem that I think exists in culture today, which is people tend to take more than they give. Another way perhaps to frame that is the issue that generosity for some reason has seemed to have gone out of fashion a little bit. So it's around that space of really just trying to inspire more giving.
Well, that is a beautiful segue to my next question, which is going to start with a fairly long introduction. So you and I met in India about a year ago at a gathering meant to spark emergent positive shifts and generosity in service based on Gandhian principles. And it was an experience that I know changed both of our lives. And prior to that gathering, we were given the names of the 40 participants who were going to be there. And so I did some research on you. And sort of buried in the info about you was this cryptic line about having a single kidney by choice, which I interpreted accurately to mean that you had donated a kidney. And as I told you when we met, donating a kidney to a stranger is something that I have thought about doing for 25 years and have felt guilty about not doing for that same amount of time. It's an act of generosity that feels to me extraordinary and almost beyond comprehension, like only saints do that. But then meeting you, I realized, like, no, people do that. People who care deeply about others and who don't let selfishness and fear stand in their way. And that's my long introduction for asking you if you could talk about deciding to donate a kidney and what the ripples have been in your life since doing that.
A long time ago now, I was 25 at the time I first considered donating. I'm 39 now, so 14 years ago. And actually the first consideration was made as I was reading an article in the newspaper about a lady called Kay Mason. She's based here over in the UK. Actually, she's extraordinary because she was the first person in the UK to donate to a stranger. But in order to do that, she first had to lobby the government to make it legal to do so. Before then, it wasn't. So it was an article about the fact she lobbied the government and then gone on to donate. And it's very strange, though. I still, you've heard me talk about this before. I still can't quite articulate the decision-making process. What I can say is that as soon as I read this article, as I was reading this article, it became just abundantly clear that it was something I was going to do. I didn't really experience any friction to it at all. And it took about 18 months to be assessed. There's a lot of physical assessment that goes on, especially actually because I was, I think at the time, the youngest in the country. So a lot of the coordinators and doctors were a little wary. There's also a long sort of psychological assessment as well, as they try and establish or help you establish whether you're motivated by the right reasons. But yeah, 18 months on from reading that article, I found myself in the hospital kind of being put to sleep and then waking up what seemed like immediately later. And it just felt in that moment, as it still does now, 14 years later, just really like the most honorable, pleasurable thing I ever will do, and for that reason, I feel just incredibly lucky to be a kidney donor. And, when you talk about feeling shame or guilt for not doing it, I mean, obviously, I totally disagree with that, and that's very you. But at the same time, part of me kind of understands it because I actually, it was such a privilege to be able to do it. And I have nothing but sort of gratitude for having gone through the experience, to be honest.
So, Tom, how often, I mean, you have a scar on your body, you see it every day. How often do you think about the person who you donated your kidney to and wonder about their life?
Probably every day in some way. And actually, most of the time I'd say that's not even really a kind of conscious thought, but I feel very much like there is someone somewhere who is connected in some way that way, and I think that's the kind of often feeling I have. But and also, so the way it works over here, I think it's the same in the US. If you donate to a stranger, you don't get any information as to who it goes to, and the recipient gets an option to get in touch with you if they want. But so I get very little detail. That said, my surgeon, who was hilarious actually when I think about it, because pretty much the first time I met him is as I was in the hospital on the morning of the surgery, 7:00 in the morning, and he poked his head round the corner, and all he said, he put his hand up in the air and he said, "Don't worry, small hands, small scar," like this, which took me a while to get, but I realized that that hand was going somewhere, so it was good it was small. But he then popped his head in after I'd woken up, and again, he wasn't really meant to say anything, but I guess he thought this would be a nice thing to hear. But he said that my kidney had gone to a 7-year-old girl. So I now have that bit of information. And of course, now she's in her early 20s, I guess. I last heard a couple of years ago that she was still doing well, which is great. So I do think about it every now and again in some email communication between the doctors and myself a couple of months after the operation. In the thread, they'd actually included the recipient's address accidentally. So, of course, in moments of, of untethered curiosity, I do often think of that email and go, God, I could just Google it and go and see. But of course, there are moral issues to that. But there's clearly a part of me that's curious, to know who they are and how they're doing. But actually, it's also entirely magical to know nothing about them, really, and just to know that they're there and they're doing well and that they're someone like everyone else.
So, Tom, you have been giving away $500 grants for kindness for a while now, and I'm wondering what some of your favorite stories that have emerged from this experiment.
Well, emerge is the word. When we set out on this, we call it a social experiment because I guess it is that. We're giving 1,000 grants to 1,000 people around the world to pay forward. And we didn't really know, what would happen at the start. And we're 257 grants in, so we're starting to get a sense of what's emerging. And it's interesting, I might start off, if it doesn't sound too negative, to give you a sense of the kind of things we tend not to approve. Because we say people submit their ideas for the website, and every Friday we go through them and we approve the ones that we feel are drop dead generous as that definition evolves. But we tend to get a lot of applications that are, I guess, very expected. There's a huge skew, for example, of ideas people have to support someone they know of locally who's experiencing homelessness, which in itself is quite insightful. I think this is sort of clearly a cause for people that feels very visceral and local, and clearly sort of unjust too. And a typical idea that might come off the back of that as a recipient is wanting to buy $500 worth of food or a sleeping bag or a couple of nights in a hostel and this kind of thing. And of course this is wonderful but what we try and unearth and encourage in people is to get imaginative and creative and think, whether it's critically or strategically or innovatively, about how that $500 might be able to stretch, or how the impact of what they might be able to do can ripple a little further. So in that spirit, actually not an idea on homelessness, but we funded a couple of months ago a lady called Joanna who lives down in Porto Alegre in Brazil, and this idea really still blows my socks off. She is a student who volunteers in her local prison. She wanted to spend the $500 buying books to set up a book club in one wing in this prison for 49 men there. And that in itself, it's kind of amazing, right? A young girl volunteering in a men's prison and setting up a book club. Sounds like the start of a movie. But she went on to say that, her goal is to get these men as confident and capable in reading and writing as possible. And the reason for this is that in Brazil, there's actually a program that's offered in prisons where they invite prisoners to read a piece of local literature and write a report for a local library. And once they submit that report, they get 4 days off their prison time. So her sort of the second stage of her idea, once she'd got them falling in love with writing, was to get them enrolled in this program and to see how many of these 49 men could get time off prison. She even has a third phase to the idea that she wants to pull off, and that's because only 7% of these prisons in Brazil are actually signed up to this program. So if she can create a case study, she wants to get way more than those 7% of prisons signed up to the program itself. So I think this gives you an idea of just sometimes $500 is sort of a lot of money, but not a lot of money at the same time. But when you see how it can, with a great idea, potentially act as a spark to create value well beyond that, and also through the story show an amazing amount of imagination and commitment, but then also this sort of tiered and phased set of goals. I think it really kind of blows your mind as to what becomes possible when you put your mind to helping others.
I want you to tell us like one or two other ones, and I want listeners, viewers to know how they could go about applying if they have an idea.
Well, to apply, it's very simple. We have a website, dropdeadgenerous.org. You first join the experiment, which essentially subscribes you to our email newsletter, and the first email you get is a kind of welcome pack that invites you to come up with an idea and submit an application. So it's a fairly simple process. The application form is probably 10-15 minutes work. But yeah, we're funnily enough, it's an interesting time to talk with you, Zoe, because we've just had we've got a couple of pockets. So again, in the spirit of emergence with a social experiment, we've noticed a couple of times over the first year how some of our early grantees have clearly been doing a good job of word of mouth in their local communities, and so we're getting other applications from their communities. Actually, Joanna, the lady working in prisons, became a grantee as a result of another grantee called Marcelo, and he has been the sort of catalyst for about 12 grantees in the area. But we've recently met a girl called Noor, who is based in Tanzania. She's actually Canadian. she became a grantee about 7 or 8 weeks ago, and we're now about 8 grants in Tanzania, and they're all coming from her, or her recommendations. I jumped on a call with a chap called Abdullah, who's one of her kind of connections this morning, and he's this amazing guy who grew up in a village with no internet and barely any electricity. And then as a young teenager, he went to spend some time with his uncle who had a computer. And in a very short period of time, once given access to a computer and the internet, he learned English just like that. You know, such was the power of it when it's not taken for granted. So with $500, he's creating a computer lab. And the picture, he's already got it sort of half set up, and the picture is this tin shack next to a school, and it's got 3 computers in there and a fish tank, and the computers are set up so the users can just access Duolingo and Khan Academy and a few of these educational sites rather than Snapchat or anything like that. But it's amazing, you know, just for someone like him to have had such a profound experience and then want to basically pay it forward by thinking, you know, in a fairly solutionary way to think about how he can give access to as many people as possible of what he experienced a few years ago.
So tell us about Move Over Mother Teresa and your hopes for that podcast. And I guess I'm also curious how it is that you're so good at naming things like programs and nonprofits and podcasts and things like that.
Well, the name is pretty divisive, actually. I got a bit of an earful just this week from someone who didn't like it much. It's called Move Over Mother Teresa, not in any kind of diss at Mother Teresa herself, but just it's really based on the idea that, you know, you don't need to be a saint these days to create change at a huge scale. And the show concept itself is we sit down and we interview content creators, social media influencers who are in some way purpose-led. It's really just trying to platform and surface and get to know and create a piece of content that inspires other people to use the internet in a positive and beneficial way. The show came about, I guess, because, you know, with Drop Dead Generous, we are trying, you know, through our grants, we're enabling a story to happen through their idea. And then we collect their stories and over time we're trying to best understand how we can distribute these stories. And, you know, the power of the story is really, I think, going to be where the potential success of this project lies. We're going back to my kidney donation. You know, actually, just before I donated, a friend of mine asked if he could make a little documentary about the process I was going through. And actually, I was quite uncomfortable with that because it felt like I was sort of doing it without really many people knowing. And then, and he asked if we could do this. And at that stage, I spent months and months in waiting rooms, realizing just how many people are there, you know, with their loved one waiting for their 4 hours of dialysis treatment that week. And I thought, God, well, a documentary might be quite interesting to raise awareness. And to cut a long story short, this ended up going out on TV. And within a year of that documentary going out, I'd had 6 or 7 messages on Facebook from people saying they'd just donated as a result of seeing that documentary. So that experience for me of doing one thing, but actually leaning in a little bit to telling the story about it, however uncomfortable that might be, led to 6 times the impact and probably more. Maybe there were people who donated who didn't, you know, take the time to drop me a little message to tell me. So this all comes back to, you know, our mission with Drop Dead Generous and really feeling that the power of these stories might be where the true impact lies. And based on that logic, you know, we have finding ourselves giving a lot of grants to content creators because, of course, they have an audience to share their story too. So Move Over Mother Teresa is just our attempt to really spotlight and surface these amazing people doing great things with social media.
It's really interesting that, you know, you talk about that discomfort with sharing the story, because I could imagine that there are people who are using that $500 in a way that has a really good story that can spread the good that can come from it even further. And they too may feel humble about it and not want to be the center of attention. And it really points to how this idea of humility can be a barrier. And I'm thinking about when we were in India and the last night, there was a big communal event that was live streamed, and you were invited to speak, and you shared the story, and it was so powerful, just life-changingly powerful for the people who were viewing what you said. And I know it was really hard for you. And obviously, humility is something that you hold very dear. If your title is chief emailer and you're rubbish at emailing, and it just points to how humility, or this sort of attachment to humility, can get in the way. And I'm wondering how you feel about that.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating thing, and again, looking back on my kidney donation, and even with hindsight, really, and even despite knowing that 6 people went on to donate, there's a real romance, there's a real comfort. Actually, there feels like a real purity in the idea of just having been able to do it without anyone knowing. And I think that's one part of where it gets tricky, is that, you do these things, you want to do these things for the right reasons. And as soon as there's an audience, inevitably there becomes other drivers and consequences, and people say, what an amazing thing you did, and you feel good about it. And it's really tricky to grapple with those little complications, frankly. And then on the other side of that, I have a real fear as well. Maybe it's caring too much about what other people think, but I would just hate to make anyone feel uncomfortable. I'm not explaining this very well. I think people generally, and this is very true in Britain, probably more than the States, people feel like it's almost inappropriate to talk about the good they do. Like it's boastful, like it's sort of proof that you didn't do it for the right reasons, you did it for the praise and so on.
Or the plaque on the wall.
Or the plaque on the wall, yeah. I've had to put my own one up on my house, but there we go. Haven't told enough people. But it's really tricky, because as of about 15 years ago, 17 years ago, certainly since the invent of social media, the good you do when heard spreads. And so, we try and encourage people to talk about what they do, because, as with my experience as a kidney donor, that's where it all started, just hearing and wanting to model someone else. And that can only happen through one story being shared, from one person to another. So there's a huge power in talking about it, but there is huge awkwardness and discomfort in doing it too. The reason, I hadn't spoken about my kidney donation for about 10 years before I did that talk, certainly not publicly or anything, and I would shy away at dinner parties from really going into it too much. And, but that time in India made it really clear to me that it's an important thing to be able to talk about in the right time, in the right audience. And actually with that, I also feel a huge amount of humility when I talk about it, because again, I just feel privileged to be able to do it. I don't really feel like I feel pride, but there's nothing in me that I feel like I can talk about it authentically now without, worrying about how it sounds or worrying about how people feel.
Well, when you just spoke about it at the beginning of this podcast, it's pretty clear how genuinely beneficial it has been for you to have done this thing. And I tend to find that that's true of generosity in general, kindness in general, that what comes back to me is tenfold whatever I give. Even if it's something. So a couple weeks ago, I had blood drawn, and the phlebotomist she was sort of gruff and edgy, and I made it my mission while she was drawing blood to just get to know her and be friendly and make a human connection to her. And so I just started talking to her, and there had been some really painful, difficult things that had happened in her life, including losing everything she owned with a natural disaster that happened in the U.S. last year. And when she was done drawing the blood and we stood up and it was time to go, I just said, "Would you like a hug?" You know me, Tom. I'm a hugger. And so we hugged each other for like a long hug, an American hug, definitely not a British hug. And then she asked if I wanted to see pictures of her grandchild, who had been taken by her daughter's, by the father, her daughter's ex. And so we looked at pictures of her grandchild for a while. And every night when my husband Edwin and I have dinner, we hold hands and say something we're grateful for. And the thing that night that I said I was grateful for was that I made the effort to be kind to this woman, because what rebounded to me was really deep. Like I felt great all day that I'd had this connection with this person who lives in the poorest county in our state. She has to commute probably more than an hour each direction. And maybe I made her day a little bit better. But I bet that my doing that like made my day like 10 times better than it made hers. And just that's the repercussion of generosity and kindness, that, you know, we think when we're doing it that we're like sort of doing something selfless, but in the end it's sort of, I don't know, it's as much for ourselves.
It totally is, you know, and all the data and the science shows us this, right? You know, you've seen big studies now that measure the happiness levels of people who volunteer regularly versus people who are, have come into money or started earning a lot of money. So, and, you know, service gives you sustained levels of well-being and happiness over a longer period of time than anything to do with money does. And even, you know, the first thing I did once I woke up from my operation actually was go and lobby the NHS over here in the UK to stop calling a non-direct kidney donation an altruistic kidney donation, because for this very reason, I think it, you know, the term altruistic kidney donation implies that there is nothing you get in return for donating. And of course, you can still do something without expecting anything in return. But the truth is, you can't do these things. You can't even give time to someone in a moment all the way through to you know, designating your whole career to service without in some way feeling something very profound. And of course, that means it's not entirely selfless, really. And that's okay.
Okay, I'm going to try, though, not to feel guilty about not having donated a kidney. Okay, moving on. You were a marketing strategist for Meta for many years, and it could seem like Drop Dead Generous and Move Over Mother Teresa are departures from that work. But to me, it seems like Meta was a departure from your true purpose. And I'm not sure what my question here is, except maybe, you know, what happened that you strayed from your true purpose for a bit?
So that's very kind of you to imply that working at Meta was a departure from my values rather than vice versa. In truth, I started there in 2017, and I walked through the doors thinking of Meta and that technology and social media more broadly in very different ways to how I did once I walked out those doors 7 years later. From a personal perspective, also, I'd made a bit of money in my early 20s, then lost it all in my late 20s. And by the time I had an opportunity to work there, proper job, proper security, you know, I think even if I had a bit of a values mismatch at that point, I still would have taken the job because frankly, I just really needed it. But but over my time there, I think social media, the sort of negative externalities of social media became really clear really quickly. And, I felt a values mismatch. I mean, I actually handed in my notice the morning after having a real breakdown in the middle of the night. I think internally at that company, obviously you still see all the news every couple of months, some kind of huge global issue at which Meta and their products seem to in some way be at the center of, whether it's misinformation, whether it's mental health in young people, and yet the internal kind of narrative you get at each and every one of these points is just this sort of broken record of we should do better, we're releasing these features and moving on to the next thing. I just didn't feel like the company were doing enough to try and be a positive influence on the world. But of course, the systematic issue there goes beyond those companies as individual companies. They're just responsible for their shareholders, and not necessarily as a kind of public utility. So I still feel very torn over kind of big tech, because I think it offers such huge promise, but as we stand today, it's extremely detrimental. We need to do something about it, really, and starting small, maybe by advocating for generosity, is just my way.
When we talked about you donating a kidney, I keep coming back to you donating a kidney, but you'll see why in a second. And it was such, to me, an extraordinary sacrifice. And I know that's not how you perceive it. But to me, it was just so huge. And you may recall, I asked you if you were vegetarian or vegan, because that seems like this teeny tiny little sacrifice. And you'd done this really giant sacrifice. So you have now been a vegetarian for almost a year. And it's completely self-serving for me to ask you why you became a vegetarian, but I'm going to ask you anyway, because I want our listeners and viewers to hear that story.
Yeah, well, so when Zoe and I met in January last year, so 11 months ago, it was quite funny actually, because I'm almost 6'4" and you're sort of not, and
That's so generous.
We were well, just I think we looked like such an unlikely sort of partnership. But you and I were kind of he was really the first person I spoke to kind of there, and there were 30 odd people there, weren't there? And we just I remember your smile, and we just immediately started laughing, and eventually started talking about the work we do, and so it didn't take you long to notice that I was a meat eater. And it was really interesting actually, because you just I guess you were the first person to sort of put a mirror up and say, God, this is really interesting that you kind of you've done some things you've done, and you work on the work you're doing because clearly you care, and yet you kind of eat meat. And it is something I'd thought about for a long time, but for some reason, I just had never kind of acted upon it, And so anyway, throughout the week, you would just continue to give me a little sharp elbow every now and again. And of course, we were having 10 days of amazing vegan food there as well. But it was just sitting with me, throughout the week of just actually kind of wondering, why have I not taken that step? But it wasn't until the last night I was lying in bed and I thought, I guess I was looking for the reason, the thing, the idea that would make me commit to it. And of course, rather than thinking about the enormous amount of animal suffering or non-human suffering that goes into sort of food production, I thought of you, and I thought if I woke up the next morning, went for a walk with you, and told you that I was now a vegetarian, and that was because of you and your work, in honor of your work and what you stand for, that you would kind of smile, that it would mean something to you, and of course, like, that's what we did, and you did smile. You looked up a couple of foot to me, and I just had this sort of beaming smile, and I think got quite emotional, and that's been the thing that I've been able to sort of hold on to throughout, is actually, the attachment to a human about it, rather than, the kind of non-human animals, which is weird, right? Because I shouldn't need some kind of human to human connection to change my behavior. It feels like it should transcend to all sentient beings. But I found that motivation, which is a good thing, albeit kind of via a human rather than all the animals. And it feels like, of course, now it just feels like there's nothing sacrificial about it, because I'm just honoring you. I'm not depriving myself of anything. I'm just honoring you. So it feels like a win-win.
It's a total win-win. It's so interesting because, I've been a humane educator for almost 40 years. I've been teaching about animal and environmental and human rights issues. I've been teaching about what we do to animals and diet and all of that. And, there have been plenty of people who've become vegetarian and vegan because they learned something from me. But you are the only person that I know of in all of those years who made that decision in a way for me, rather than because of what they learned about the impacts. I wish I could clone you so that would, I could have that kind of power with everybody. Because I not only don't I have that kind of influence, I have been known to push people further away if I'm too direct, as I was with you, but it just had the opposite effect for some reason.
I could handle the directness because there was humor. And actually there wasn't judgment, or there kind of was judgment, but actually it was very open and again, kind of humorous. And actually you were just really curious about it. So that's why you were kind of pushing me and trying to understand why I was someone who ate meat yet did the work I did. So there was nothing, but I do understand how people get pushed away. And actually I find myself very conscious of this is wrong too. And especially as we were talking about, this earlier, about to what extent you kind of speak up about these things. But, I find myself being quite conscious of talking about it to make people, in case they feel uncomfortable about eating meat. And, I don't want it to there be some kind of implied judgment. So, it's a sort of sensitive and strange little area, but yeah, just like being able to do it through just honoring you. And actually I've been thinking, God, is that can that be a thing? Can people kind of who want to do something positive with the way they go about life actually do it in honor of someone else and tell them, and it sort of becomes a little bit of accountability. It becomes a little bit of a kind of gift, I guess. But I wonder if, because this just works so well for me in terms of actually helping me make that change, feels like it could be a thing,
Well, I didn't even know that you did it for me until you told me the story about, being in the grocery store and, you're checking out and the cashier asked if you were vegetarian because of what you were purchasing.
Because of 15 tins of lentils.
And after you said yes, and they, asked why, and you said, or I can't remember I might get this wrong, you can correct me, but, I think she asked if you were doing it for the animals or the environment or something, and you said, no, for my friend Zoe. And the idea, that was the first I heard that you had made this decision for me. And I thought, wow, I mean, I know we're good friends, but I better not do anything to piss you off, like for the rest of my life. Because, what if that's not a good enough reason if I were to do anything? I know I won't, because we're friends for life.
No, totally want to honor you. And I guess, the thing is, I knew all the information already, right? So I don't know, this again just feels like an interesting point on a psychological level for those who seek to educate, like how many already know most of what you're saying, of course, like framed in a powerful way with data, with all this kind of stuff, and with solutions on hand and all this kind of stuff. But I think when you already sort of intellectually get it, you sort of need something else to kind of hang your hat on and then kind of act by. Or certainly I did in that situation. I still can't really explain why. I would feel very, it's great. I found that excuse, but it's weird, the human psyche there of knowing how horrendous it is, knowing, yeah, but just not acting on it for so many years.
So how has it actually been? A year's gone by. How's it been to be vegetarian?
Good. The first handful of months were great. I struggled a little bit. I mean, it coincided with me just getting out of the routine and the love for cooking, actually. I think once we got back from India, I had a really kind of slow handful of weeks and, spent a bit of time, making an effort with what I ate and what we ate at home and stuff. And then early summer, I got really busy and then just it actually ended up getting quite well. But I don't think it's anything to do with not eating meat. I think I just became very run down, which sort of kicked me back into thinking, okay, let's kind of work a little bit harder with what I'm eating and how to make it interesting and stuff. But it's been great, and as with anything, doesn't take that long for it just to become kind of normalized. And yeah, the main thing is that it's never really felt like a sacrifice. It's just felt like a privilege.
So have others asked you, have your kids asked you, why are you doing this? And does it come up?
Yeah, and I think we might have spoken about this a couple of months ago, that this sort of strange feeling as a parent. I'm so sort of sensitive to them just eating food that's going to make them healthy rather than food they want to eat. And so I have been pretty careful when they ask of explaining kind of why. And again, I think you quite rightly disagree with me on this, and that actually the best thing to do is just to be, really honest and say what you think and actually educate them. For some reason, and maybe it's just a maturity in myself, but when in like a year or two, they're 3 and 5 now, and for some reason I just feel comfortable with them being a little bit older and then being able to kind of talk to them properly about it, knowing that they can kind of make their own decisions without, with just a little bit more maturity to them. I appreciate that sounds kind of wrong, because of course they're not really often making their own decisions by eating meat at school and wherever it might be. But yeah, I found myself being kind of careful with how I talk about it with them.
So I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think we need to be really careful with how we talk to very young children. I mean, we don't want to traumatize them with what we actually do to non-human animals. It's so ghastly. I think with Forrest, raising him, it was just, they're our friends. We don't need our friends. We always had dogs and cats in the house, and we wouldn't eat them. So it just was sort of normal. And in fact, I feel like I erred by letting Forrest see undercover footage of what we do to animals in factory farms when he was too young. And I did this thing. This was I think actually a good parenting move. I hired Forrest when he was young and he didn't want to write. He hated writing. And I was worried that he was not learning how to write and school was not doing the job. And so I hired him to watch films from the perspective of a teenager, first a young teen, then an older teen, because I was a humane educator and I had to evaluate these films for their appropriateness for young people. So he was my quote unquote guinea pig, and he had to write a synopsis. He had to talk about what he learned. He had to write it well. There couldn't be errors. If I was going to pay him anything, I didn't pay him much, but I paid him something for his work. But anyway, one time I'm having him watch this film And he was alone watching it. I shouldn't have had him alone watching it because it was just such horrific animal cruelty in farming. And I walked in, he was watching it, and he said, "Mom, I'm just not like you." And I thought, oh, here it comes. He's going to tell me like he just doesn't care about these issues the way I did. And I said, "Oh, okay, tell me what you mean." And he said, "I think that these people who do this are evil and they should be killed." So he wasn't like me because I extended compassion toward those who abuse animals, and he didn't think they were worthy of compassion. Anyway, he was young. He does not really think that they should be killed. But it was a pretty funny moment. Anyway, I'm glad that you're not telling your kids, like you should not be telling your kids about what's done to animals. Okay, I want to move on. I want to ask you, what do you want to see unfold from this experiment of Drop Dead Generous and from Move Over Mother Teresa? Like if you could paint a picture of how these initiatives could lead to long-lasting and systemic changes, what would that picture look like?
We really have no idea what any kind of version of success looks like here, and it's quite intentional because, again, in the sort of experimental mindset, we're trying not to sort of project on it too much and just see what emerges and build upon it. But with 1,000 grants, I guess the hope is that maybe a handful of them go on to become big things in their own right, where the grant maybe just was the initial almost seed funding for something that turns into something big. But I think what is more exciting to me is all the other stuff that is probably pretty unable to be measured. What is the impact of, someone in South Africa who did this thing on, their son and daughter when they're told about it, or, just the sort of, if you've got 1,000 people around the world doing something generous with this money, what is the impact on others when they hear about it and when they see it? How does that audience, how does their kind of perceptions change and their sense of opportunity to do more good sort of get tweaked in the right direction? So it's what's the ripple effect of it all? And again, I don't know how we're going to measure that. We have a kind of university partner as an academic partner, and we're sort of talking with them about how we might actually go on to sort of measure all those ripple effects. But I have a feeling it'll really just be in the anecdotes and in the little story you might hear in 15 years' time of someone who heard about something and went on to do something else, which made this happen. And, I'm quite comfortable really just preparing for and accepting and being comfortable with the unknown impact that will come from it. But we have, it's currently planned on being a 2-year project. Every decision we make is for it to be a 20-year project or more. So of course, to make it sustainable, to grow it, to make it last longer, we're probably at some stage going to have to do a better job than this answer at defining what success looks like.
So when the $500,000 is gone, if you want it to be 20 years, so I would imagine that means more people coming in to fund this initiative than the seed of that $500,000 that launched it. Is that what you're imagining?
I think there are two paths towards sustainability. One is that we prove through doing this that we create an amazing opportunity for another philanthropist to come and give us a next batch of money to give away. I certainly think that's possible. Speaking to our current philanthropist and gaining his insights on the community of sort of big ticket philanthropists, there is a real lack of opportunities as a philanthropist to give in a way that generates impact that is clear and easy and human to understand, right? So our output is stories, and they're everyday people doing everyday things. And A lot of impact in other philanthropy just looks like data or looks like, over long periods of time. And I think just on a human level, there's enough money out there for philanthropists to be able to donate in the sort of traditional way, but then also in a way that, perhaps gets them a coffee table book at the end of the year of all the stories they've kind of enabled that they can sit through with their family. I will never be a big ticket philanthropist, but I think if I was, this is the kind of project I'd fund. So we are kind of really trying to, with our current philanthropist, really, connect him to the impact that he's creating in ways that perhaps his other philanthropy can't achieve. So that's one option. To be honest, the preferred option is actually to find a sustainable model. In January, we're kicking off with a corporate speaking proposition. And we've got a talk developed, which is, we've got a bit of a framework, and it's, how various insights we've seen from the 257 people who have carried out a project with our grant money. We've got a bit of a framework for how that might apply in the workplace across company culture, innovation, leadership, and this kind of thing. And I don't know, I think, with that alone, it might be that we can bring in enough money to continue giving away the same amount of money we are once we run out of this initial pot. So I'd like for us to find a way to basically leverage the stories to bring in more money to continue doing it. I think that would be a very cool thing to achieve. So that's what we're going to try to.
I'm in my 60s, so of course, coffee table book makes perfect sense to me. But I'm also thinking about a Netflix series that tells every episode is a story about one of the recipients and what they did. And I don't know, that could be more generationally.
With a thousand grantees and stories, there are some amazing ones out there. In fact, I just wrote a post about a chap called Chris, who's, I think, our grantee number 208. And he wanted to spend $500 on 40 burgers. So, unfortunately, beef burgers. But, this as a sort of initial idea kind of wasn't particularly interesting. It was for the homeless community in London. But there was kind of more to it, basically. He runs a Facebook group. The group is called the Wetherspoons Game. Wetherspoons is a pub chain here in the UK. And basically, his backstory could be a Netflix documentary in and of itself. He was, in 2019, I think, he had cancer and he was homeless, living in his car. And his friend took him to one of these Wetherspoons pubs. And they put a photo of themselves up on social media. And some of their friends saw their table number and through the Wetherspoons app started ordering them food and drinks as a surprising little act of kindness for them. And he was so moved by this that he set up a Facebook group and tried to get other people to do the same, basically, to invite people to post a picture up with their friends and just have strangers order drinks from wherever they were, order drinks to the table. And actually, for the first couple of years, it seems, and Chris, by this stage, had got a house, he'd been put up by the council, and his cancer treatment was going well. But he was basically just seeing people put up their photos, and he was the one sending them drinks. He reckons about 70% of his income at one point was being spent just buying drinks for strangers, trying to get this sort of game off the ground. Anyway, fast forward just a couple of years, and there's been £4 million spent through the group buying drinks, of strangers buying drinks and food for strangers. Just nothing more than an act of kindness, random act of kindness to people. And it's extraordinary. So once a month, they basically encourage the group to all buy food and drink for a particular table. And they have a charity partner that goes and distributes it to a homeless charity. And they've raised about £80,000 doing that on these sort of monthly campaigns. So that's what his $500 grant was going towards catalyzing. And on that night, they bought 40 burgers, but it ended up being about 1,000 different meals and snacks for the homeless community. But, again, it's absolutely extraordinary to me that someone with cancer sleeping rough in their car can experience an act of kindness like that and want to go on and want to do what they can to make other people experience it, and then do it successfully, thanks to technology, to a huge scale in just a few years. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I can't help but wonder if you were to invite this incredibly generous person who is paying it forward to know about this other aspect of food, if that could catalyze something further. Just a thought.
There's 1,000 things wrong with or imperfect with what he's doing, right? Because a lot of it is booze. It's 4 million revenue for a big pub chain, which is, owned by a pretty divisive guy and all these things. But yeah, and he's, I've got to know him since, and he's really, really trying to think, what can he do with what he now has? Where else can he take it? So he's that kind of guy, he's trying to do more.
So my last question for you is, what would you like your epitaph to be?
Desperately tries to think of something witty. Don't know. I've never thought about it. I'm going to sort of scoot around this a little bit, but one of my good friends has just spent the last 3 weeks in a hospice with his dad. Dad got ill over the summer, and it all progressed pretty quickly, and got put in a hospice 3 weeks ago, and Ollie went down to see him, and then actually sort of never left, to stay by his side. So rather than an epitaph, all I want in that moment is for someone such as my son or my daughter just to kind of be there, to have made whatever difference is needed for you to have someone who really cares kind of there for you, when it kind of matters, right? I've just been so blown away by how this chap Ollie has been there throughout, and he even said, so his dad passed away just this Saturday. Obviously he's absolutely heartbroken, but he said, I saw how important it was for my dad that I was there throughout, and we laughed and we giggled and we got to know each other even better. And and that he's passed is devastating, but I have no regrets because of that time. And I think it's Scott Galloway's a sort of professor at NYU and media personality, but he says the same thing, actually articulated it exactly this way. He said, if when you're lying there in your final moments, you have people around you that care and appreciate you, you've done your job, you've done your thing. So whatever epitaph, so I guess it's maybe the epitaph should read, if you weren't there at my last breath, then bugger off.
See, you got to the witty comment in the end. It's funny because as you were speaking, I was thinking, I'll be there. And then I realized that I'm 25 years older than you, so I better not be there.
You'll be waiting somewhere else, maybe.
You can be there when I die. How about that?
Yeah, deal.
Tom, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to have you here and sharing all that you're doing, and you're a role model for me and a dear friend, and I'm so grateful for all you're doing in the world.
Ditto, Zoe, and it's an honor to be on this show, and I can't wait to become an avid listener.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe.
Thank you for listening to Solutionary Voices. If you want to learn more about Tom Cledwin, you can find the URLs for his organization in the show notes. And if you enjoyed the episode, please share it with somebody else. And I hope you'll subscribe and write a review. And if you want to be a solutionary yourself, I invite you to read my book, The Solutionary Way. Thanks so much.